Hey guys, so today we're going to go over the very first step into trigonometry, and that is understanding what trigonometric functions are. So in any given right triangle, the first thing we're going to do with trig functions is we're always going to start from an angle of reference. And in this picture, our angle of reference is going to be called theta. Theta is just a fancy mathematical term for an angle of reference here. And so whenever I'm referring to some function of theta, what I mean is I'm starting from the perspective of this angle. So from the perspective of this angle, there is what's called the opposite. So the opposite of theta, we're just going to call it the opposite. That's of course the side that is straight across from this angle theta. And then there's what we would call the adjacent of theta. Theta is adjacent, meaning it shares one side that makes up this angle. And you might think, well, if that's what adjacent is, then this side must also be considered adjacent. Well, it is adjacent to theta, but this is a special side in a right triangle. If you remember from before, we always referred to the longest side, the side across from the 90-degree angle, is referred to as the hypotenuse. So when I'm referring to adjacent, I'm referring to the side that is next to theta, but it's not the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the longest side, or some people say the side across from the 90 degrees. And the opposite is always the one across. And of course, this could change depending on what theta is. Let's say I have a triangle that looks, kind of like a reflection. If my theta was up here, all of a sudden my opposite side is now down here. And my adjacent side is all of a sudden over here. And my hypotenuse, again, is always the longest side. And again, right now, we're just assuming we're dealing with right triangles. So we need to make sure we have that in there. So this side is not always the opposite. It depends on where theta is. And now that we have those things ironed out, we can start to discuss the three basic trigonometric functions that we're going to be dealing with. And the first one we're dealing with is a function called sine. Fully spelled out, it's S-I-N-E, but in trig functions, we're just going to label them with only 3 letters. So sine of theta is the ratio between the opposite side of theta and the hypotenuse side of theta. So whatever the length opposite of theta is and whatever the length hypotenuse of theta is, that's going to be my ratio. Okay, and the next trig function is going to be called cosine of theta. It's just spelled like sine, but with a co in front of it. But again, we're only labeling them by 3 letters. So cosine of theta is the ratio of the sides, again, from theta. It's the adjacent side compared to the hypotenuse. And so cosine is just a ratio of whatever my adjacent is, this green side, to my hypotenuse, this blue side. Whatever those lengths are, that's my cosine of theta. And then that leads me with my third and final basic trig function, which is what we call tangent of theta. And tangent is going to be the ratio between, first off, the opposite side over the adjacent side. So basically the idea here between sine, cosine, and tangent is these are going to help us find ratios between sides in a right triangle. And one simple, helpful tool to remember the ratios and which sides go with which function is there's this really common name, and it's called Sohcahtoa. And I'm going to write it out like this. I'm going to write it out color coordinated so you can maybe see what I'm referring to here. And so Sohcahtoa is a really helpful thing to try to remember. It doesn't have any mathematical significance outside of the fact that it's just an acronym to help you remember the order of stuff. It's sort of like PEMDAS with the order of operations. People come up with an acronym like "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally" to remember the order of operations. Well, this is a really similar thing. And what it means is this. If I have my sine function, it's the ratio of my opposite over the hypotenuse, which is what I have just said over here. And for the cosine function, it's really just my ratio of adjacent to hypotenuse, which is, again, what we said right here. And then lastly, my tangent function is just my ratio of my opposite to my adjacent side. And that is what we just said over here. So Sohcahtoa is going to be a really helpful tool for you. I would really recommend writing that down. If you're working on a homework assignment, write it at the top of your list. It's just going to make life a little bit easier for you to keep track of which sides you're dealing with respective to which trigonometric function you're dealing with. So this is a basic introduction to what sine, cosine, and tangent are. If you want to see some examples of this put into practice, go ahead and click on the video that I'll put on the screen right now, and have a nice day.